expect applause at the end, but that's okay, thank you. So,
We do that to,
I think everybody got a card. I think you still have a card coming to you, but I want to give you a card so you have my information if you want to reach out to me later. I'll also be around for the coffee and dinner as well, as you know that's a regular routine. Again, my name
I'll be
is...
sitting around an attendance sheet, so make sure that you sign before you go.
I'm going to talk a little bit about, I have this very, very kind of corny title to this talk today. If you know anything about architecture and sustainability, we practice what's called LEAD, so we're leading the way. It's pretty queer, but anyway, I thought I'd still do it anyway. So, I'm going to share with you a little bit about myself very briefly, and then spend most of the time talking about sustainability in terms of our practice and what we do in building buildings all around the country. But I did want to start, one of the things we do as a firm, we work exclusively for colleges and universities. We are education architects only. We're a very rare firm in the United States. You will, if you Google architect or college architects only, you don't find very many like us. Most firms do a lot of everything. We do only what you find on a college or university campus. So as such, I have spent the last 30 years working with colleges and universities of all sizes. I work very often with student groups talking about all different kinds of facilities. We do residence halls, we do campus centers, science buildings, engineering facilities, visitor centers, performing arts facilities. We do anything and everything you can find on a college or university campus. The only thing we haven't done is one building type, and that's a president's house. We've been asked a couple times, we said no because we don't do houses, but we do just educational facilities. So I work often with college groups just like yours. And my normal start to a conversation is first having everyone introduce themselves, tell me what year you are and what your majors and or minors are. Just so I know kind of who's in the class. You can just go around the room real quick.
My name is Lucas. I'm a second year. I'm a biology major with environmental studies concentration.
Okay.
I'm Lily. I'm a third year. I'm a theater and sociology double major.
All right.
I'm Joe. I'm a third year. I study history.
Chris, I'm a third year biochemistry.
I'm Cameron. I'm a first year intent computer science major.
Okay.
I'm Sean, first year, and I'm intended physics major.
I'm Ben. I'm a third year economics psychology double major.
I'm Jose, a fourth year economics major.
I'm Vishali, a fourth year economics major.
I'm Jelani. I'm a second year sociology major.
I'm Lewis. I'm a third year history and poli-sci major.
I'm Anthony. I'm a first year attended econ major.
I'm Sal. I'm a third year and I'm a chemistry major. I'm Derek. I'm a third year and I'm a bio major.
I'm Jeremy. I'm a fourth year history major.
I'm Caleb. I'm a second year history and French major.
I'm Hassan. I'm a fourth year economics major.
All right.
I'm Hero, second year, and computer science and religious studies concentration.
All right. Well, thank you. Spend a lot of time with, again, with student groups on colleges talking about different facilities, so that's what I like to start, so we get to know everybody. I'll find out about this young man and whoever's coming in here just a little bit later. That's okay. I also tend to move around in the workshops and presentations we do, so hopefully I won't get too far out of that. I know we're being recorded for posterity's sake. I wanted to start with something that has nothing to do with sustainable architecture at all, but I've been wanting to be an architect since I was about age 6. And so in high school, I was such a geek that I drew the different levels of the Starship Enterprise. So you have to recognize that I grew up, Star Trek was actually on television as a regular show. That's how old I am now. And so this was always one of my desires. I was always interested in engineering and architecture since a very, very young age, and so I just wanted to share that with you. I also, in high school, back in my old high school, you used to take a drafting class as a senior. And in that class, it was a first semester course. I drafted a house. This is a part of a house plan, as you can see. It's got dimensions on it. They had a competition every year, And in that class, my house was chosen to be the house that would be built the next semester. So in my high school, if you were in shop or in any sort of the technology classes, what they did every year was build a house that actually people moved into later. So it was a little bit like community college in that if you were in shop, you did electrical, mechanical, you constructed, roofed the house. It was a really interesting program. So you did it through the spring and then the following summer, and then they would sell the house every fall, and the proceeds of that house would pay for the next year's house. And they had been doing this for years. But I had the opportunity to both work on the house a little bit, but then also draw it. So from my perspective, I've always been interested in architecture. This house, however, was never sustainable, never intended to be. Because think about that, this is a house from the 1970s, and there wasn't a whole lot of sustainable architecture going on at that time. In terms of the agenda today, I wanted to talk a little bit about just sustainability in general, but then wanted to talk specifically about LEED. LEED is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. That is I'll explain in a little bit more detail, but it's now, in a sense, it's not a federal body or organization. It's just a nonprofit, but they have established a whole series of rules and almost codes now that dictate how you can build a building on a college campus or any sort of building from a sustainability standpoint. I want to share with you some examples because our firm also does a fair amount of research in sustainable design. So we've done a fair amount of analysis of different systems that go into facilities. We think we're finding the things that work versus the things necessarily that don't work well, and some of them you find will be somewhat interesting. Also want to talk about the cost. I want to spend just a little bit of time about the firm itself, and then I want to leave the rest of our period for any other questions you might have about architecture and/or sustainability. So from the standpoint, these are statistics from last year. They're the last statistics I had available to me. This is the cost of construction of all things built in the United States in 2018. And as you can see, it's divided into three different categories. Infrastructure, those are the things, everything from pipes under the ground to roads and highways, to residential construction. And please note, residential is the largest component of construction still. If you are an econ major, you're talking about GDP. That's a huge driver of the United States economy. And then non-residential, which would be anything on a college or university campus, a high-rise, a strip mall, a church, anything else in that category. But what we also have statistics are the cost of sustainable projects. And you can see it's still remarkably a fairly small percentage of the overall total. And that's somewhat unfortunate. Doesn't mean that there aren't more sustainable projects being built every year. It's just that LEED goes ahead and tracks specifically the projects that they're aware of. So the good thing is we hope there are a few more sustainable construction projects out there, but from a standpoint, we've got a long way to go, particularly with residential construction. The other part of the story, knowing that LEED has been around and sustainable construction and design has been around for about 25 years, where it really took hold. Interesting, of all the places that you would think are the least sustainable in the United States, it would be Vegas. Who's been to Vegas? Anyone? Wow, am I the only person that's been to Vegas? That's probably okay. If you ever go to Vegas, they're the largest consumers of electrical power per capita, per square foot, because everything they do is lit up. It's about gambling. It's about lights and glitz. But what was very interesting is the UBC became a powerful enough entity that all of a sudden it was putting pressure on casinos. And now the interesting part was it fell into a category of, as you can read it, about allowing smoking in casinos. I'm guessing many of you haven't been in a casino either, but generally they are smoking environments. This whole campus is not a smoking environment. But interesting that the power of that, wanting to change from smoking, and you say, what does this have to do with sustainability? Well, LEED, as an organization, chose not just to talk about the sustainable part of construction and design that saves you money, uses less resources, but they also had a focus on the human being, the idea that we want to make healthy environments. Well, smoking goes exactly against that. So these new casinos that were being built were still allowing smoking. So they put some tremendous pressure. Now, they didn't necessarily succeed, But it was interesting that then a group of these casinos ended up becoming members of the USGBC, which was somewhat ironic because, again, they're huge consumers, yes.
What does USGBC stand for?
I will go ahead and I'll tell you. It's the U.S. Green Build Council. And again, most people think it's a federal agency. It is not. It's just a nonprofit. But they're the ones that designed and organized LEED, which is then the mechanism by which we design these facilities. I don't know if you've ever calculated your own carbon footprint from a sustainability standpoint. I have a really bad one. You can see the average is about 22 tons of carbon associated with the usual student. I've done my whole family. They're all, you can see, they're all up there. The animals, of course, basically have no carbon footprint. All they consume is food generally, that of course has to be made and then transported and purchased, but otherwise they have almost no carbon footprint. The rest of us have generally average carbon footprint, very close to the national average. I unfortunately have a very large carbon footprint because I travel 3 to 4 days of the week. I am not in St. Louis where we're based. I am somewhere else in the country because we worked almost in all 50 states. We worked at every corner of the country, and so I spend a tremendous amount of time flying. That is one of the least carbon-based means of transportation. The other part, just again a little bit about me. I'm a product of the energy crisis of 1973. I don't know if any of you are history folks and look back at that crisis. I can remember being in line in a car with my father trying to buy gas when gas stations didn't have much gas to dole out. So you sat in line for an hour and a half waiting to get gas because petroleum products were being squeezed in the United States. That was a time when in the United States we generated we didn't really produce any petroleum, we imported it all. And what that led to was consciously a decision by all kinds of folks to think about what are the things that would make us more sustainable where we can be less reliant on petroleum products. I also, as a young boy, and I don't know who gave, I'll pass this around so you guys can look at it. I was given this book, and a very, very interesting book. You can see it's Survival 2001, so it's a little out of date. But I think it was published in 1975, so I was still generally pretty little. And it's a fascinating book about looking to the future, about finding ways to generate renewable energy sources. And if you look through that, you will find that many of them now are being used today. But think about these engineers some 50 years ago coming up with some of these ideas. At the time, they were crazy, but almost all of them have now been tested by different innovators and trying to find another resource. I've been working for architects since I was in high school, which is generally unusual, but I just had the opportunity. I wanted to be an architect so bad. I got a summer and a job after school in high school working for architects. Graduated in '84. I would classify myself and our family as being kind of suburban sustainable. I don't drive an electric car. Again, I have a fairly large carbon footprint, but I recycle, we have a garden, we compost. Something that many people forget about being sustainable when it's about housing and or architecture is we live in a fairly small home. Of course, 5 members now, 3 of them on their way out. But in any case, there's something also about excess when you speak to sustainability. Live on a street that has 32 other homes. More than half of the homes were torn down. This is a neighborhood, a 50s 50s old neighborhood. More than half the homes have been torn down, and what do you think they were built back as? McMansions is what everyone calls them now. 5,000 and 6,000 square foot homes, which sometimes have just 2 people living in them. So regardless of how sustainable you design that structure, you still have 2 people in a home that's oversized. So even that's somewhat important. And then as LEED was developed, I became a LEED professional. So it's a certification process that's available. You could all be a LEED professional if you wanted to. You just have to study and take a fairly difficult, long exam. But you'll hear a little bit more about the firm and how important that is in terms of the work we do. And so we grow our own food, and of course we harvest it, we pickle things. So that's our little bit of story in terms of sustainability. In terms of the firm, my firm is Hastings and Chivetta Architects. We've done almost $5 billion worth of construction and college and university work around the country again. Some 15 million square feet. We're 59 years old, so we're not technically first generation, we're second generation. We have 45 employees, and so we're a fairly unique firm again because we specialize in only working with colleges and universities. But we compete with the firms. So the firm that did the Husk, is that now what it's called? Is that correct? That's a firm that has 1,500 employees. So we compete with much larger firms trying to do those kinds of buildings. What is very unique about our firm, relating back to LEED, everyone that is a professional, part of our professional staff, are LEED professionals. They've gone through that certification, they've taken the test. Very rare in terms of architects or builders to have everyone be LEED. So generally speaking, it's in the DNA of our firm, and really what makes us unique as well. LEED, and I'll talk a little bit more detail about this, but LEED is a system by which you rate buildings after they've been completed in terms of how sustainable they are. There's several other metrics now that are used to judge sustainability in architecture. These just happen to be the levels. They're not listed here, but you can be a registered project, you can be silver, gold, or platinum. What we're finding today, and I don't know how many are on it, we've done a whole number of them all over the country again. We also have done a number of what we call LEED equivalent facilities. A LEED, in a sense, has almost outgrown its value in terms of paying a lot of money to become registered and certified and then get a plaque based on those levels of category. And interestingly, the Husk, which is a very sustainable building, it would probably be somewhere between gold and platinum. They chose to save somewhere between $300,000 or $400,000 to not get the plaque, so to speak. But it actually, from a sustainability standpoint, is really a very remarkable building. In terms of the process and the approach, there are kind of two different approaches to pursuing sustainable architecture. One, of course, is doing it specifically by the requirements of LEED. The other is doing sustainable architecture that kind of reaches outside of that metric again. This is kind of a category. One of my, on the agenda item, we'll talk a little bit more about cost, but LEED generally, sustainability, as you all know, regardless of whether it's related to architecture or whatever it might be, generally has a cost associated with it. There are very few things you can do sustainably that are no cost. So from a construction standpoint, there are some things, and we've been doing these. I tell people all the time when I talk about sustainability in architecture, good architects have been practicing sustainable design for hundreds of years. We just didn't call it that, but just how you orient a building, how you mass it, the number of windows, which side the windows are on, those kinds of things naturally relate to sustainability. But then very close to that system of registered, silver, gold, platinum, there are a whole category of things that we can do that are sustainable in design that relate again to what the cost is. So, if you really think about it, the most expensive ones are kind of ones you're probably all familiar with. Some of these were done at the Husk, I know they have a very large geothermal field that was done out on the soccer field area, those intramural fields. I know that was torn up for a couple of years while they were doing that. That's one of the best but very expensive things you can do because, interestingly, colleges are very different from the rest of the world that builds and purchases buildings. If you're a developer, you buy a building, you design it, you own it for about 5 years, and then you flip it. It's not about holding on to the resource. It's about selling it and making as much profit from it. So there's no incentive in that kind of economic sphere to do anything sustainable. But when you own buildings for 100 or 200 years, like a Grinnell does or any college or university does, these kinds of things, while expensive, they actually start to have a very good long-term return on your campus. So I wanted to talk specifically about LEED and what LEED is. Again, it's governed by the United States Green Build Council. They've become quite a large business. This is a nonprofit that just a few years ago had accumulated $100 million in assets. Now, they don't build or create anything. They just simply tell you if your building is sustainable. And they have a significant number of employees. They have a whole huge number. They are also worldwide. I'm going to focus on the U.S., but they're worldwide today. You can see the number of projects, 90,000 projects around the world, almost in every country. Interestingly, while only a few years ago they had over $100 billion in assets, they have become so successful at what they're doing, but also so expensive at what they're doing, they're now actually running a deficit. They don't have a strategy yet to maintain what they're doing because now there aren't enough clients wanting to do buildings like Grinnell did for the Huss, where they actually pay them a lot of money to certify that that building is highly sustainable. So they did a tremendous job in getting sustainability on the radar and out in the forefront, but now they've almost priced themselves out of the market. So we don't know how long they're going to remain with only $44 million worth of assets, but I do know that they're now trying to do fundraising to start supporting their losses because they still have brought great value to the market of architecture and building. The other thing that's interesting, and I'm one of that 200,000, the number of people that now have become a lead professional. The other piece that specifically speaks to LEED is when they originally developed this almost 30 years ago, it was very interesting. You're coming up with a concept, a notion to say, okay, how are we going to judge buildings or construction that's sustainable? And they came up with a whole subset of rules, and it was really interesting that just a few people came up with this idea, and then it took off so dramatically. The good thing is their organization has adjusted to the marketplace and expanded what they started. So originally, you used to just have the ability to go ahead and certify a building, and it could be a house in Albuquerque or an academic building in Maine, but the process was exactly the same. Because it was so new, they hadn't really gotten into the details of it. What they finally done is expand this so that now there are different categories. Because what we found is doing a sustainable home in Albuquerque, they have a very, very different environment than Maine does. You know, it snows in Maine, it's cold, they don't have the same energy resources. They burn diesel oil in Maine versus in Albuquerque, it's almost all electric. So there were different categories of issues that came together to say, well, we need to expand this. So now they have a whole series of different categories that now you can have your building certified in. The interesting one are finally doing homes. There was no category for homes, so again, there was no real reason for someone to spend extra money designing and building their own home and having it be LEED, because you couldn't really meet the same metrics that a very large 200,000 square foot academic home or an academic building might have. They've expanded it to include cities and communities, so now there are a series of actual communities that are now LEED certified. And that's really very broad, but it means every building built in that community, every means of transportation, how energy is used in that community, are all looking for sustainable solutions to go ahead and extend the life of that community. LEED's been around long enough that you can have buildings recertified. I'll talk a little bit later, but some of the very, very first LEED buildings were failures. Because again, they were starting from scratch, and they turned out to not be very sustainable at all. And then LEED Zero, that goes back to carbon footprint. I don't know if you know, but it's called net zero building. You can build buildings now that basically require no energy. Some of them can even be plus net zero, so they supply energy back into the grid. And they never had that until this is just very new, but now they have a special category just for that building type. And so we have LEED, but we have a whole series of other sustainable initiatives that relate to construction or architecture. And so since LEED started this, and I won't name them all, but there have been a whole series of other groups. The one that you might be most interested in is the American College, the Climate Commitment Letter that was signed. This was a group of 650 schools that decided to go ahead and try to reduce CO2 emissions on their campus 80%. And I don't know technically if Grinnell signed that letter or not. I think they did. What most schools did was they rushed to sign this some 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, and then they found how difficult it really is to do this. And so a number of schools are starting to drop off or rethinking at least the time schedule that that they agreed to. But I will tell you, it was really remarkable. What it speaks to is that higher education, we're one of the leaders in sustainable design. Again, witnessed on this campus by most of the new buildings. But it really has taken student bodies were responsible for putting pressure on boards at all of these different schools so that they would go ahead and start implementing as many sustainable initiatives on campus. Now again, I'm speaking specifically about buildings, but there are many other sustainable initiatives. Everything from asking boards to, of course, no longer invest their endowment in petroleum-based companies. That's a little bit more difficult to do today because, of course, petroleum companies do a lot of things than just pump oil. But in any case, that's the kind of, it's been student really led, that's led colleges to be at the front of this, which interestingly is why our firm has been doing what we've been doing, because of course our clients have been asking for this work. These were the, in addition to the categories for the actual building types, LEED also has a whole series of categories that describe what are the things you're doing with your building in terms of the metrics you're looking at. So everything from location and transportation. How do you get to a building? How do materials get to that new building? Where is it located? Is it on a bus line? All the things, does it have even bike racks? There are a whole series of categories that relate to that. Sustainable site planning is about reusing resources on site, gathering roof water, doing the things that plant, not irrigating the areas around the building. Safeguarding water and water efficiency. You've probably all heard about waterless urinals or toilets, the different versions of toilets that exist now that are high flush and low flush. What's another good one? Low flow shower heads. I don't know if they've put those in any of the residence halls here. But there are a whole series of things you can do about safeguarding water. Then there's energy efficiency and renewable energy sources. Most individuals that aren't necessarily embedded in LEED think mostly about sustainability from the standpoint of saving resources in terms of energy generally. But as you'll see, it's a fairly big piece of what we do. Conserving materials and resources, indoor environmental quality. This is where it spoke to having natural light, which we don't have very much in here today. Natural light, excellent mechanical systems, so you're not breathing old, dirty air or dusty air, the things that make working in an environment the best for you. They also had a set for doing innovative, sustainable strategies. So whatever you're planning or designing, if you can come up with some new idea that might be more sustainable than what you've heard before, you can get points for that. And then again, they've now made adjustments for regional priority. Early on when LEED was first developed, if you owned a home in Key West, Florida, everybody knows where Key West, Florida is. It's about the southernmost point in the United States. They had requirements for how far material could come that you could build in your building. Very similar to work we've also done in Alaska, where it is so far from resources, everything that we build when we do projects in Alaska, everything except for two things, water and sand, everything has to be shipped to Alaska, no matter what you build in Alaska. A house, you'd think that there's, we've done several projects in Alaska. I literally believe that, oh, well, they have trees, so they have lumber, they have concrete, because they have sand and water, they have all these materials. They have nothing in Alaska. It's very similar to Hawaii as well. So the priority, the regional priority, was actually really hurting sustainable approaches because you'd have to get material from over 500 miles away. And it really was interesting from the standpoint of even the point structure that was developed for LEED. What it was really designed to discourage was the idea of I'm building a building on the campus of Grinnell and I'm going to import marble from Italy to put in your building in Grinnell. So think about that process. Now, while marble is not technically a sustainable product because it can't be regenerated, we have plenty of marble, but it's fairly expensive to extract, cut, put on a boat, ship, refine, ship them to Grinnell, and then install. So that was one of the reasons they developed the regional priorities. That was a very good idea. It worked very well. So why was it created? Well, again, they had no system by which we could judge sustainability in terms of architecture or construction. So it started off really being about kind of occupational health and the environment. also about financial return, because of course, if you can save energy, you can save money. Great idea was developing at least a standard of measurement so that you could start to judge different buildings equally. The idea of greenwashing, that was kind of false claims about someone claiming, oh, I have the most sustainable building in the world, but the reality it isn't, it's just because I said it was. Very much the idea of promoting kind of the whole building process also as well, so that it's about feeling good in the building. And then the last one really was about how this process is integrated into the design, so it starts very early in the process. You wouldn't assign a lead building or a category lead to a building after it was constructed without the intention of all the way through the process discussing the things you can do that are LEED or sustainable. Some of the benefits, of course, it's going to reduce natural resources. Most everybody thinks about the bottom line. That's not always the most important thing for LEED, but certainly what they were interested in. Again, occupant comfort and health, and then the idea of basic community benefits, because you're doing everything you can to reduce wear on roads and infrastructure and sewage systems, all the things that, of course, buildings put pressure on. In terms of the market itself, it has grown to become quite large. This is statistics. I didn't put it's from LEED, but these are their most recent statistics in terms of building types. You can see really residential, multi-use kind of counts toward residential, but really not. So you can see housing is not on here because unfortunately it's still such a sliver of the market. But you can see, let's see, which one's education? 15% maybe. So education, both collegiate and K through 12, really became an early kind of market share of developing these kinds of different building types. Higher ed in the red, I guess, which is kind of 8%. So this is a good thing in that it has at least gone off of campuses from education, and we're finding at least some other folks doing it. We see it more in museums, community centers, libraries, as they're shown up here. But unfortunately, we're not seeing it in churches. We're not seeing it in anything, again, as I mentioned earlier, that's developer-based, where you're trying to make money by building a building. The process itself is a 4-step process. And I won't go into a lot of the details of this, but they're kind of obvious steps. And you have to pay a fair amount of money to do these. But the first one is registering the project. There's a series of paperwork. And usually what you want to do is you register the project before you even start to have conversations about how sustainable it is. You simply want to get it into the USGBC to get started the process. They then track this, and once you actually have registered a project, all the way through to the end of the world, according to the folks at the USGBC, it will always be in their database. And of course, they want it in the database so it can be used as a teaching tool. Statistically, they can continue to look at the different building types and see which ones do better in terms of their sustainable nature. So you go through that process, then you have to officially apply. The application goes in after the building has been designed, and now they've changed it where they want 1 year of data about the building. So when we do LEED projects now, all of the systems in that building generally are tracked. Of course, we have great systems to do that. There are all kinds of tools and software that can do that for us. In some buildings, I don't know if there's an example of this on your campus that's actually LEED certified. I'm not really sure that you even have any. But we'll have a dashboard, so when you walk into the building, you can actually see what the energy consumption is the moment you walk up to that screen. We're always tracking that data. And so you go through this point scoring, you get a year's worth of data. You then, in the third step, go ahead and turn it in to the USGBC folks. And that's when they start judging, or in a sense challenging, the points that you're asking for through this process. One of the things that we found a little bit disingenuous about the system is rather than, let's say, embracing the idea that as a client and an architect you wanted to do a very sustainable project, they look for reasons to actually knock your points down. Sometimes we feel they're a little too aggressive in this manner. We'd really rather have them be very open to new innovative ideas and do the things that, you know, make it a very special process. Instead, they kind of look for the things that kick you out rather than get you more points. So it's a little bit of struggle. We've done enough of them. We actually have pretty good rapport with them. We can have pretty strong arguments why we should receive the points we're interested in receiving. And then the last thing, of course, is then they tell you that you've met your certification. Basically, after all of this, you get a plaque and a certificate. The plaque goes, you can go ahead and mount the plaque in your lobby of your new building. One of the things that they talk about, and this is not me speaking, this is information you basically get from the USGBC again, but these are the benefits. Now, you can read them faster than I can tell you what they are, but really, you think about it, what's the real benefit? One, it's third-party validation. Of course, that just means that what they're saying is you can't claim you're not something more than you are. You can, although this has really changed very recently, early projects received a lot of support from utility companies and from federal grants and state agencies, and those have all slowly started to erode and or evaporate. We have a current administration that couldn't be more not sustainable. We don't have to talk about that as a good discussion point, but that's led to a number of states really retracting most of that support. Of course, your project goes to the database I talked about, so it continues to be a means of learning from previous processes. You get your plaque, as I mentioned. You get that official certificate. And then, of course, you can market everything you like. The colleges and universities did a significant amount of marketing, mostly to attract students like you, talking about, wow, we just opened this highly sustainable building. It would be on their websites, it'd be in their alumni magazines. The problem is almost everybody's doing it now, so it's kind of lost that marketability. But certainly the bigger part of it is, it's a wonderful opportunity from a sustainability standpoint. I didn't ask Doug this before, but were there any classes specifically related to the construction of the husk? Do you know, either way, anybody? Did they have any kind of class or anything related, kind of track the sustainable plans that were done for this building? Apparently not, no one raised their hands. That's something that we encourage when we're doing a project on a campus. One of the first things we offer up is, would you like to roll it into some form of a class in your curriculum? Kind of like the class you're in now would have been perfect. And then you go ahead and follow the process so you can see what architects and engineers have to do along with their client to make the building very sustainable. In terms of the scoring, so this is all about getting the 4 different levels of sustainability, so of course it requires scoring. Those are those same categories generally I mentioned before. So you can see there are more points in energy and atmosphere than anything, because of course that has one of the greatest returns on the investment. But then you can see how the points are scattered. You can see the point totals for the certification thresholds. I know of no buildings anywhere that I know of that have reached 110. It's very difficult. The platinum projects we've done have been in the 90s because again, they're kind of always, you can't build the perfect. The most sustainable building, by the way, would be a building that has no windows, has no heating or cooling system, uses no water, so it would have no bathrooms, couldn't use it at night because it has no electricity. I mean, that would be kind of a 100-point platinum building, but again, then it really wouldn't be a very useful building in terms of how you wanted to use it. So, again, they've increased the number of innovation points, which is very nice, so we're always doing research to see what we can do to come up with a new way to provide sustainable opportunities. The indoor air environment one has also remained generally very high. They're very conscious. But this also goes to the lead study itself, which is if you just say your building is going to be a smoke-free building, you get a point. Now they've changed that a little bit, but that's how they started. They thought that was so important. So you talk about it, that's like the easiest point. All you have to do is just tell them that you're never going to allow smoking in the building. So part of this was also, when it was first done early, some of the points became somewhat almost ridiculous. They were too easy to get, and they didn't necessarily change behavior. Now, you could argue that if we're going to make a building non-smoking, that's changing behavior, but not necessarily. It just forces smokers outdoors. So then, of course, most campuses have made campuses entirely smoke-free, which then forces you off campus. I don't know, what is Grinnell's campus right now? What's the policy at Grinnell?
Sidewalks.
Yeah.
You can't be in buildings,
No, it's just the outside sidewalks.
and do they mark them? I mean, are there some that are smoke and some smoke-free, or they're just, you have to be outside on the, okay.
It's on the main streets.
Okay, all right. Well, that's not unusual for some campuses. I have been on several where you can't smoke at all anywhere while on the grounds of the school. And so, again, that would mean you want to live off campus if you're a smoker. You know, that doesn't necessarily change behavior, but it's a good idea. I did bring along, I'll pass this around as well. This is the actual scorecard. And unfortunately, this has created somewhat of a problem when we talk to clients, because you would think for everything we're doing to design and make a building very sustainable, well, it's simply you just check some marks on the scorecard and you're done. I didn't want to bring one with me, but the actual submissions end up being, a couple of volumes like this. So the amount of work that you have to do to actually have your project go through this lead process is very substantial. So it's very deceiving that it looks so simple to have this one sheet of paper and you simply get these different points and then of course you become a LEED certified building. But the effort is much greater than that. In fact, again, the cost of what has to go behind filling this sheet out becomes fairly significant. I did want to update this. I've used a graphic like this in most of my sustainability presentations. This speaks to then basically the environment of our nation and which states are most sustainable, or at least have some form of support through state government legislation that supports different states in their use. You can look at the different states. Iowa has no strategy one way or the other. There are about 23 states where any state money and or federal money that's spent on buildings in that state need to be LEED certified. So that's one reason we do a number of college or university. Particularly, we work, of course, for private colleges and universities, but we also work for a number of the big state institutions. Well, that's state money, so those projects have to be sustainable. You can see Oklahoma actually is just the opposite. They're doing the things, of course, they're penalizing any sustainable strategies when it comes to codes and or structures. The most recent, the second most recent EPA the director of the country was from Oklahoma. He lost his position, but of course he was selected specifically because he had been the Attorney General in the state of Oklahoma, and he was really behind turning it into a red state. I'm not going to diss too many institutions, but we're the university architects for the University of Tulsa. That's a private school with about an endowment of, I think, about $600 or $800 million. It's, I think, about 5,000 students, has a beautiful campus. We do a lot of their architecture, so I can say that. But it's a very nice campus. They have absolutely zero sustainable strategies, and in fact, their board is made up primarily of oil, gas board members, some communication. So we cannot discuss designing or building sustainable structures on that campus, even though they're a private institution, even though their own students have really spoken out against not having a sustainable campus. But that's just the reality of funding and who's in charge of the board. Now, what the board doesn't know, and you'll only hear it from me in this room, as the architects for the buildings we do on their campus, we actually make them fairly sustainable. We don't go after any kind of LEED rating. We never tell anyone on campus we're doing it, but we're still doing things to make the buildings as energy efficient as we can, saving water, doing all the things that would make their projects legitimately sustainable. We just choose not to share it with the client. Some of the folks on campus, the business officer, the facilities director, they know what we're doing, but we don't share that information with the board. It's really not worth it, and it's okay that we're saving a little bit of energy for them. In terms of it says top 5, but I added 5 more to it, so it's really top 10 states. It's very interesting, and if you think back to some of the states that were kind of in the middle. Texas, of all states, you wouldn't think as being necessarily, again, because of petroleum. They drill more oil there than you think anywhere else in the country. that they wouldn't be so sustainable, but actually because of wind power, they've actually really, they're very similar to Iowa, that they're really pushing to have a state that's supported by wind power. They've moved up substantially in terms of where they are from the standpoint of sustainability. LEED tracks these in square foot in terms of number of people in each state. So it's very interesting. What is not so interesting is, though you can guess, I didn't do the bottom 5, but the bottom 5 basically are right here. The Southeast has still done almost nothing to support sustainable opportunities in terms of codes and or governments from the states in any form, whether it's financial or just interest in having projects be sustainable. But this is Illinois is a little bit of somewhat of a surprise. You wouldn't think Illinois was Chicago itself, being such a large city. But between the architects that are in Chicago and outstate Illinois, if you've ever driven, anyone from Illinois? If you've ever driven through Illinois, they're very similar to Iowa. They're pushing substantially for wind power. And so ultimately they might find themselves in a position where their energy consumption, at least statewide, might be very, very high from wind power. And I don't know if you know, I don't know technically whether or not Grinnell owns a wind turbine or not. But you know, the state of Iowa is trying to be as conservative as the state of Iowa is, at least from a sustainable practice standpoint. Iowa, and I think it's 2030, they're shooting for all energy consumption in the state of Iowa by 2030 or 2050, I can't remember which metric, to be 100% renewable. Almost all of it being wind power, but they're well on their way because I think they've eliminated almost all coal burning in the state. And again, this is not something that the state is doing in terms of legislating, because Iowa's a fairly conservative state that way. It's actually individuals, groups like LEED, and then the utility companies that are finding this to be actually a very good return on their investment. Of course, I do a lot of reading and studying about LEED and its value overall, and so I found some quotes over time, which I think are very interesting because as great as LEED started 25 years ago, it's kind of become somewhat political in nature. You can read these again. You know, it's a measurement tool, not a design tool. I think I would disagree. It's actually a design tool for us now, which I think is really very good. You know, it started by 3 people in a room as a great idea. It grew into a global standard. I think that's fantastic. The things that LEED has done to change the way buildings are now designed worldwide is just fascinating. The best part is, and the reason LEED somewhat is starting to almost outgrow its usefulness, we now have codes in place in most states, at least national codes, not state codes, but national codes, that deals significantly in better and more efficient means in which we save energy in a building. So how super insulated buildings are, how the mechanical systems work, how we power those mechanical systems have really changed. You can see it's a money-making political machine. Some people have had that opinion. Once they had $100 million, you know what they did? Of course, they went out and they hired a lobbying firm to lobby Congress. So it did become somewhat political. And then I like the quote about sustainable development. It is an oxymoron. Anytime you build anything, even net zero, you are still doing something in a not positive way to our environment, because of course usually it means taking land away from something else. So I wanted to talk about some actual examples. And I just picked out a few. We've done some work in researching these and finding their value. The first one is photovoltaic panels. That's kind of a go-to. When people think about sustainability now, that seems to be the buzzword. You can put them on your house, you can put them on buildings. They're still very expensive. This is an example of a facility, and you'll see this is a non-traditional photovoltaic system. You've seen the type that are the large panels. They're usually mounted above a roof. They look very much like a photovoltaic. This is a slightly different system. It's applied to a metal roof, so it's a little bit more low profile. Doesn't work when it snows, of course. But you could see in this case, we put it on the south slope of a very large building. It was a $250,000 investment. you have to think about what does that mean from an investment standpoint. You can see it was donor funded. So a board member at this school said, you know what, I'm going to give you $250,000 to do this. So in one sense, that was awesome because it was free. So the payback becomes zero. If it were not for that free gift, the payback's about 25 years, which is not necessarily in the case of a photovoltaic. They haven't been around that long, so we're a little worried. They do degrade over time, so the payback, you have to, of course, the payback can be shorter. If the cost of energy goes up, the payback gets shorter. But right now, the cost of energy in the United States has actually been very flat because we have a low cost of natural gas is driving down both electric and natural gas in terms of heating your home. PVs also typically lose their energy over time. So they just degrade and they aren't able to capture as much energy. So this is just one version. Exterior sunshades, depending on where you are in the country, the idea of shading a building can actually reduce energy costs. This is a model where we looked at one of our projects, both analyzed the cost of the shades and then kind of ran the mechanical system analysis using shades or no shades. We have computer software programs now that allow us to make that determination pretty quickly. You can see 10-year savings of $150,000. That's assuming no increase again in the cost of utilities. The shades themselves were a little bit less than $92,000. You can see, in a sense, over 10 years, there's actually a 5% return on your investment. Now, again, you're saving money, so whether you want to count it as a return on your investment, it's kind of up to you. And then there are other considerations. It's how it can actually, this is not the same building, so it was this building we did the study on. You can see it has a significant amount of glass. It was generally south and slightly west-facing glass. That had to do with the site, but the building scale and even what shading we can do outdoor, even outdoor shaded spaces also can contribute to cooling as well. So another example of something that we've looked at carefully, and again, we would suggest, depending on a building's orientation, depending on where you are regionally in the country, this can be a good cost saver with a good return. Another one is we've done some studies on simply building filters. This is the kind of stuff relating to sustainability that you probably have never seen. But there's a very, very large, probably on the scale of that unit, mechanical unit that is supplying, of course today it's probably warm air, during the summer it's cool air being dropped into the space. This is in that category of things you don't see that are sustainable. The design of these 25 years ago, all they did, they had a big fan, and you either blew cold air through that fan or hot air, and they did nothing. There was really no sustainable design at all. Now these have become very, very sophisticated, even to the extent that the filters have become very expensive but very sophisticated. Now the filter, if you live in an off-campus apartment and have just a regular furnace supplying you cool air in the summer and hot air during the winter, that has about the cheapest kind of filter. This filter is probably $15 at Ace Hardware. They're not even very, they do almost nothing. They keep leaves from blowing through a house, not high particulate matter. These are super expensive, but also very good filters. And of course, by having these very good filters, we do everything to reduce fan speed. We deliver better air to each one of the different spaces in the building. Interestingly, the only issue with these, and that's this light replacement, is very key. I've been in meetings. I had a facility director stand up and say, this is fantastic. We'll put all these great filters in my brand new building, and then 6 months from now, we're going to have a cut in my budget, and then I'll no longer be able to put these expensive filters in. So when you want to make these decisions, you also have to remember they have to be supported over the long term, because again, putting bad filters in a unit like that, in a sense, you're just throwing away money, because that return on investment is actually pretty good. That's only a 16% savings required to pay for itself every year. And we're talking, in this example, the building was saving 45% of its energy costs. So while that sounds like a lot, you think you've just gained another, whatever that math is, 42.5% back that you actually get to keep from a savings standpoint. Another one is doing the benefits from the light monitors, the light switches. I don't know if there's one. I don't know that this room has one. This building might be old enough, but one of the things was the idea of course, you know, when you leave a room and you forget to turn off the lights turn off for themselves. It must have one somewhere, but I don't see it. And so these very early were kind of, you know, low-cost means by which to save energy. We don't burn lights, we're saving energy. Very interesting. They're not very expensive. A room like this would typically have two, but I still haven't found one. There might be one back right up there in the corner, it looks like. They don't cost very much. Very similar to this space. This space is not quite 2,000 square feet, but you get the idea. It has a pretty quick payback. But what's very interesting, we did a little study at Oberlin College. Oberlin's a little bit like, they have a big endowment. They're very, very sustainable. They were doing sustainable architecture before LEED even really came into fruition. We did a little study with them where we compared lighting two different side-by-side residential halls. And so one was a test residential hall where the students in that hall were told nothing about light monitors or turning off the switch, but that hall had those monitors in every room, in the kitchens, in each individual room, in the bathrooms. So it was a fully functioning building where you walk out of the room, the lights should go off. In the other residence hall, they had no monitors, but instead they asked all of the students to turn off the lights every time they left a room. And they incentivized the students for a semester to do that with the idea they'd get a big party at the end of the year. Because that works. And they really encouraged them to start just turning off the lights when they left the room. So, you know, the test was, while these are valuable and saving money, it turned out that by changing behavior, we could save even more money. Because after a semester, what we found was, by turning off the lights immediately, instead of having a machine turn off the lights, they were saving electricity. So by changing behavior, we saved electricity. The reason for that is the industry, when they first developed the monitors, they, for whatever reason, never could uncover why they did this. But it used to be when you'd walk out the room, the lights would stay on for 8 more minutes, with really no reason why. But when you think about in a residence hall, going in and out of your room several times a day, even an academic building could be the same case. You go in and out many times. We had our engineers calculate, you know, we just kind of made a test case. If you went in and out of a room 20 times a day, that's 20 times 8 minutes that the lights are on more than they need to be on. So we then went ahead and tested it with the Oberlin folks and found it actually really, as long as you can change the behavior, it was actually more cost effective to turn them off immediately than wait the 8 minutes before they automatically turned off. So it was kind of a, you know, this is where we go a little bit beyond just normal LEED strategies. If you do this in your building and once your building certified, you get a point for doing that. What we've discovered is it's not necessarily the most sustainable thing to do. Eventually I'm going to get into the new building, the Husk, and my guess is every room and office has one of the light monitors in it. But we're now, if we're not pursuing a building specifically that has LEED, we're like, you don't need to do those unless you want to change behavior. So you still have to change the behavior. That's the key. That's the key to the success of this. Another one is about lights in general. This is an old number. But when I started, of course, in architecture, we had only one kind of light bulb, and it was the same light bulb that Edison designed. It was an incandescent light bulb. We now have LED light bulbs. I'm guessing this building is so old, it just has regular fluorescent bulbs. So now that we have LED, you all know what LED lights are now, and I'm guessing the new building is probably, every light in that building is an LED light. It's really amazing the amount of energy that you can take out of the building, particularly from incandescent to LED. Now, early when we were doing sustainable buildings, the cost of the lights were so expensive because the technology was so new. We did very few. It was very hard for clients to make that decision to spend. You know, in a good-sized building, you could be talking about spending $1 million more just on fixtures. But the cost of those have come down so much. We now, whether it's a LEED building or not, all of the lights are LED lights now, in almost all facilities we do, and we're seeing that throughout the industry as well. So it's kind of an automatic saver, and it's pretty tremendous. You'll see some other data about how much it can save. Also skylights. Now, we've only done